Everyone hits a bump in the road. What do you do with it? Be inspired as we explore the ways people experience, navigate, and manage the ups and downs and twists and turns in this road trip called life. Welcome to another episode of Bump in the Road. The basic podcast is always free. We also have a premium subscription called Bump 2 that lets you listen in on extended behind-the-scenes conversations with our guests. Check it out at www.bumpintheroad.us. What inspires one to become a doctor? It's not necessarily the ideal life. Long hours, years of expensive training, and stress are all part of the lifestyle. For Fumiko lad Chino, her path and her motivation for becoming a physician was a most unusual one, motivated by her experience with her late husband. In 2005, she was an art director of an entertainment company in Houston, her ideal job. She fell in love with Andrew Ladd, a PhD candidate at Rice University. They got engaged, then married, but then, as Fumiko says, their lives were spectacularly derailed on the road to happily ever after when Andrew was diagnosed with a rare cancer. Andrew's medical bills rapidly exceeded their ability to pay them. He died before he turned 30 years old. The entire experience of losing a loved one and being hounded by debt collectors set her on a most unexpected path, first to medical school, then into radiation oncology at Memorial Sloan Kettering. Her mission is to shed light on and address the financial toxicity of our medical system. Fumiko, welcome to Bump in the Road. If you would, give people a little bit of background on your story.
Sure. It's a delight to be here. So, I am currently living in New York City and I'm a practicing oncologist. I treat breast and gynecological cancers, but I was never really supposed to be a doctor. I met the man who would be my husband over a decade ago in Houston, Texas. And at that time, I was actually an art director of an entertainment company. So very different from a physician. And like many love stories, we fell in love. We got engaged to be married. But unfortunately, our lives sort of spectacularly derailed on the way to happily ever after. And it was not far into our engagement when he started to get very, very sick. And he, was throwing up. He was losing weight. He was having a lot of pain. And he went through a number of false diagnoses before he ultimately got his diagnosis of cancer. And then from that moment, we sort of spiraled down into the cancer treatment pathway. And ultimately, it was, despite some good initial responses, aggressive treatment was not enough to save his life. And he unfortunately died before the age of 30. Along the way with his cancer journey, which I hate the term cancer journey, but it's strangely apt in some ways, we discovered that he was horribly underinsured. And we faced a lot of costs related to his cancer treatment that really put us in some uncomfortable situations. And those costs, unfortunately, followed me after he died. And ultimately, kind of our travails through healthcare, the costs are ultimately the reason why I ended up going to medical school and then ultimately being a cancer doctor and ultimately doing the type of research that I do, which is in financial toxicity or how the costs of cancer care are affecting access, affordability, quality of life, and sometimes ultimately cancer outcomes for many patients with cancer in the United States.
Going from being an art director to a medical school student is a huge jump. Talk about that. Was that difficult?
Yeah, it was. It's fun to be honest. Going back to school as an adult is strangely fun. I don't think I was in the greatest, mental condition for doing it, but I think objectively, if you are a lifelong learner, as I think we all think we are, it's actually nice to have time to really just sink in and learn new things and explore, something maybe that you were interested in before, but you never got time to explore. I've been always really interested in biology. So for me, it was actually kind of a welcome distraction to being a grieving widow. I ended up throwing myself into school, into studying. It gave me a purpose. Um, I will say that the field that I'm in, which is radiation oncology, has a very strange analog to what I used to do, which is digital imaging, because it's all very image based. It's three dimensional. You know, uh, what I do on my day to day basis as a radiation oncologist is not so far different from Photoshop, to be honest. So that's sort of a welcome corollary to my work now and my work then. But yeah, it's a big shift. I think I went from being an art director of an entertainment company to being back in school with people who were more than a decade younger than me, and so that was a little bit of a shift of thought.
Were you nervous about the application process?
I think if you talk to any physician, we're all sort of type A personalities. We're all, driven and passionate, and we understand that there are significant sacrifices that go into having a medical career. Um, so I thought, you know, I'll give it a shot. I thought I had a pretty good chance of getting into medical school, but yeah, I had some anxieties. I think anytime you think, oh my goodness, I'm competing against people who are right out of undergrad and they're so motivated, and they haven't had to carry around this extra weight that I've had to with all this grief. Um, I'm not sure if I can really compete. Um, but in reality, I think living in a real world and having a job and you know interacting with people within any kind of standard career, it's very different than going to school. And I think that gives you additional reference points and strength that maybe someone who went straight through medical school, straight from undergraduate to medical school, wouldn't necessarily have. So I think there's definitely some assets from being a returning student.
What happened to all the debt that had been incurred through your husband's illness? Did it follow you through medical school?
It did. I kept even getting threatening phone calls all the way through medical school. And it was at the point in which I was publishing one of my first pieces about financial toxicity. When I know this is silly, but like it never occurred to me that my own personal story was itself um, powerful. I had sort of kept it to myself. I hadn't really told anyone about it. And we were, talking to the marketing team at Duke, which is where I went to medical school, about the piece that was coming out. And they said, well, do you have any patients who've been through this that could maybe share their story? I think it could make this press release more powerful. And I said, well, I don't really have any patients that I can, give you their number for, but I can tell you my story. And that's what sort of spun into me realizing that it could be powerful for me to share my story, to root the work that I do um, in both data and anecdote, I guess.
Well, I think anecdote is important because it's how you connect people. But data is obviously what the medical establishment wants because you have to quantify things. I once spoke to a physician who was doing a study on the impact of your environment on a patient's, healing. And we kind of chuckled over it because we both said, well, of course it matters. And she said, yes, but I have to have quantifiable data.
Yeah, it's sort of insane to think that we need to prove that high costs matter because, of course, they do. And I think increasingly, one of the reasons why the term financial toxicity has really taken off is that patients really understand it. They understand that costs can be a toxicity just like any other. And it's sort of there's no one really out there who hasn't had someone in their family that hasn't had a poor outcome related to their cost, either from having to make incredible sacrifices, having to cut back on other things for their life, or ultimately being having debt that they carry around with them. I think the codicil to me sharing my story um, for that first research article that got published is that I ultimately found out that I was not responsible for the debt because my husband and I, as a young married couple, just starting our careers, we didn't we didn't own anything. We didn't have anything. We didn't have any mutually shared assets, as the phrase is. So there was no there for people to, if you were going to, come at me for money to collect from my husband's debt, there was nothing there. I was actually myself only sort of a black hole of money. Um, so, if there's a silver lining to sharing your story, is that people will actually come out of the woodwork to tell you that you do have rights and that I was not actually responsible for the debt. So thankfully, again, silver lining is that I learned more about kind of what family members' rights are, in terms of these um, these medical debts that seem durable after death.
One of the things I think that's so difficult about navigating the medical system is that no one takes you by the hand and gives you the 30,000-foot overview. They don't tell you, "This is what's going to happen. These are the treatments you're going to need. This is, what your insurance will cover." Those discussions just don't exist.
Yeah, it's striking. I was just part of, in my day job, I'm a researcher. I'm a treating oncologist, but in my spare time, I participate in a couple of other service oriented projects. One of them is Cost of Care, which is a global NGO dedicated to try to improve affordability. And as part of that group, we just had our affordability accelerator. We kind of gathered people to try to brainstorm solutions to the affordability crisis. And one of the real highlights of that meeting was this takeaway where, like, the person who is the most responsible for coordinating the delivery of healthcare, including the cost and insurance, is the patient. The person who is literally the least qualified and the least supported in that role. You are the person who are obligated to call your insurance if you're having a problem with a bill. You are the person who is tasked with coordinating your physical therapy visits, scheduling them. And it's a huge burden to place on someone who is, quite frankly, already sick. So the person who really should just be focusing on their health and in kind of improving their functional status, is then duly kind of tasked with all of these administrative burdens. I always think that we should have a financial ombudsman for our patients. Someone um, whose only role is to try to help people kind of navigate through their their cancer treatment. And we're starting to see that with patient navigators. We're starting to see that with financial navigators. I just think there's such a huge gap in between sort of how cancer care is delivered and how it should be delivered.
Well, the problem is you're walking into a maze in a system you don't understand with implications you have no clue about. Um, and you're emotionally terrified, potentially facing your own mortality. It's an impossible place to be. And somehow we all manage to navigate our way through it. But it's so ugly and it gets repeated again and again. It drives me crazy. As Einstein once said, his famous quote, "You're nodding your head." Doing the same thing again and again and expecting different results is the definition of insanity. And we perpetuate this insanity in our healthcare system.
Yeah, I have to say, even specifically as a cancer caregiver, as someone who was not receiving the cancer treatment, but sort of witnessing and trying desperately to advocate for my husband in healthcare, to be his voice when, for example, he was too sick to have a voice of his own. Um, you know, we're also kind of the person who is the least informed about outcomes in terms of what the actual kind of benefits of things are. We're also the people who are the most emotionally charged. If you're in the hospital watching your young husband die from cancer, I think if you had asked me kind of value-based care, was it worth $1 million to keep my husband alive for 5 more minutes? I would have said yes, of course. I mean, I think I would probably still say yes right now with all of the research that I've done. So, the grieving family member is often the person kind of making some of these end of life decisions. And they're also, again, they're the ones in theory who know what their loved one wants, but they're also the ones who are the most emotionally devastated by a bad outcome. And it's just an impossible situation. It's like that's it's not a fair question to ask. And I mean, and being a physician now myself, I've seen it sort of repeated in ICUs again and again and again, where you have devastated family members kind of being asked what they should do next. Even though I know personally as a physician that doing this invasive procedure will probably not change the ultimate outcome. um, the one kind of tasked with making that decision is the loved one.
How do you convey that to somebody? And what what's your responsibility in terms of laying out that kind of I hate to say cost benefit because we're talking about a person, but say the personal cost benefit of that type of situation?
There's this really phenomenal decision making sort of logistics layout that's called kind of best case scenario, worst case scenario. And it's really rooted in patient values. And it takes a while to kind of suss it out because you need to know what's important to both the patient and also the family members, and what's the functional status that would be acceptable. But you can kind of lay out, so if we're talking about an ICU visit. I remember for my husband who was in the ICU, they specifically said, his oxygen saturations are decreasing. He does not tolerate the BiPAP. The next step would be intubation. And you can go down a best case scenario, worst case scenario for that. You could say, okay, best case scenario, he's intubated for a brief period of time. He is going to be in the ICU for a couple of weeks. He's going to recover some function. He'll need rehab, but he'll ultimately make it home very debilitated. And that is the best case scenario for someone who is intubated for advanced cancer. And then you can go worst case scenario, which is he will die on a ventilator in ICU and you will never be able to talk to him again. And I think with that framework, it really kind of helps you understand what maybe, what the decision making points for the individual and for the family. Because my husband was terrified of not being able to breathe. That's one of the reasons why he did so poorly with BiPAP, because it is very close to your face and it's almost, ironically, it's suffocating even though it's helping you breathe. And so he never would have wanted to have that happen for any substantial amount of time. And it was, this decision making process is very helpful if you know that even in the best case scenario, the tumors are going to continue to grow. Like his breathing is going to continue to worsen. And it's not, the intubation is just one step in the short term that does not make a difference in the long term.
How has this changed how you practice medicine?
I think that by seeing both sides of the stethoscope, it really does give me a perspective in terms of, trying to spend the time with each person to suss out what their values are, what matters to them, trying to acknowledge the fact that cancer treatment is hard, even if you have, stage 1A breast cancer, that it's challenging for you, it's challenging for your family members. It can be costly. Our own evidence suggests that there are people who are, going to have such incredible costs related to their cancer treatment that they'll ultimately be bankrupt or homeless. And I think it's that extra layer of comprehension of how important this, I mean, cancer obviously is important, but how some of these decisions, you know, why it matters. It's not just being cancer free. Sometimes it's being debt free or having your kids' college tuition intact, or having food on the table. Some really kind of fundamental things about living life and surviving with purpose, right? It's not just enough to survive. You have to actually, have a life to return to. And I think, unfortunately, cancer treatment and some of the toxicities, including financial toxicity, is really destroying some people's lives. So even if they do survive, you know, it's a lesser than life that they're coming back to.
There was a JAMA study that said that on average, cancer patients spend about 11% of their income on out of pocket healthcare costs, not including health insurance premiums. And for people to understand how much this can be, to give you an idea, I spend $1,000 a month on a healthcare premium with a $7,600 deductible. That comes to $20,000 a year for healthcare.
Yeah, I think what's sad is that a lot of people, even with spending that much money on healthcare, it's still not covering everything, and
No.
it's still there are so many things that fall into the gap that patients, sorry, that we're still not even studying yet. So lost income, opportunity costs, time costs, parking. I mean, these are all things that are incredible costs to patients and families, and they're still not well documented. There's so much burden that we put on people, and I think, in terms of the onus for healthcare providers, for healthcare systems, it's really to try to improve how we deliver healthcare so that it can be more efficient, so that we can cause less harm to people. I mean, there's the whole do no harm, right? And I do think that some of our treatments really are maybe creating more problems than they are fixing. And it's a tragedy to think that okay, you got your mammogram as scheduled because you said, everyone says mammogram saves lives, and then you were diagnosed with DCIS, which is a pre-invasive breast cancer. So then you had surgery and you had radiation. You're taking hormone therapy for that, and ultimately that means that you lost your job because you didn't have pay time off, and radiation is a daily treatment. So by doing everything that you could to activate your health care, you got diagnosed with something that may or may not have ever actually affected your lifespan. And then you have the financial toll of that. I mean, it's a cascade. And at any point, I feel like, we could be doing better for our patients.
The financial, you did a study on parking and the cost of parking, which sounds trivial, but it's not. Because if you go to a medical center that's far away in an urban area, you have the cost of travel to get there, the cost of staying over, just the medical costs. And then to add insult to injury, some of the parking costs are outrageous. And it's almost just a small indicator of the many, many costs that add up from a patient's perspective.
It's literally death by a thousand cuts. And I can tell you that the parking is the thing that you have to take out of your wallet to leave the hospital. The bill for Andrew's chemotherapy would come in the mail, and it might come months after he actually received his infusion. But to leave the parking lot, we had to actually pay $18. And it adds up. It's sort of like a copay for a medication that you have to pick up. You have to give them the money to get the medication. And so those are, it seems so trivial, but I will say that maybe that's how me being a caregiver influenced my work, is that, and how I move forward, that because I've been wanting to do that study on parking costs for the last, decade. And when I initially brought it up to someone that I was going to study parking costs, I literally got made fun of by other researchers. They said, "Well, that's so trivial. Why would you want to study that?" And I was just like, "Well, because it matters." Like, these costs matter. It's a way that we're nickel and diming our patients. It creates a lot of negative ill will, and it's also, again, quite expensive for certain patients. And that can be quite simply the barrier for someone to participate in a clinical trial or not, or to receive care at, the hospital that they should receive care at. I treat gynecological cancers. Certain types of cancers need to be treated both with external and internal radiation. And the internal radiation for us is done in Manhattan. And I've had people say, you know what, I can't go into Manhattan for that treatment, even though it's recognized that it's a superior treatment because of travel and parking. So it really is a barrier for people actually getting the care that they deserve and need. And yeah, it's the trivial things that matter sometimes.
Well, and also the other thing I think patients face is that medicine's very siloed. Everybody has their specialty, and they, from a patient's perspective, it often seems like they don't communicate very much, and the patient is left having to fill in all the blanks. Um, how do you improve that? The siloing of medicine has given us extraordinary focused care in different specialties, on the one hand. On the other hand, I think a lot slips through the cracks.
Yeah, just within cancer care, you have, multidisciplinary team often taking care of you. And for example, someone with breast cancer, there's the surgeon, there's the medical oncologist, there's me, and then sometimes there's a physical therapist or the genetics team. And even again, with just treating that one disease, there's so many people that honestly should be involved in the discussion about optimal treatment. And I think, I'm blessed with being at a cancer center that really focuses on multidisciplinary care. But, you could be, you know, having a very discordant conversation with someone, without, I've, miscommunication is rampant in medicine. And, someone will say, well, my surgeon told me that I needed to have this done. And, and I think it can foster some distrust in healthcare. It can certainly foster confusion in a lot of patients, and actually just clear and open communication between providers and patients, but also between provider teams, is really essential. So, whenever I see a person, I say, I'm going to get off the phone with you because a lot of my visits are still telehealth. I'll tell the patient, I'm going to get off the phone with you, and then I'm immediately going to have a conversation with your surgeon and your medical oncologist about what the next steps are. And we're going to make sure that we're all on board about the best treatment path. And so I do that with every single consult because I do think it's so important to coordinate care. And sometimes that's even like follow up visits. I will emphasize over and over again to my patients that I'm going to set an arbitrary follow up visit so you don't follow up my schedule. But I want to empower you to know that if you have just seen, X physician, then you don't need to see me then because that's back to back visits. Nobody needs, twice monthly pelvic exams. You really just need one every 3 months. And then I'll also emphasize to them, if you see that I'm moving your appointment, it's because I saw that you just had a pelvic exam and it was fine. And again, I'm just trying to coordinate your care so that we're not over doctoring you, because I do feel like sometimes someone will survive cancer, but then we doctor them to death. We they can't go into recovery survivorship when they're seeing a physician every month. So I really try to facilitate their survivorship care too, to make sure that we're getting optimal follow-up and surveillance, but that we're not overburdening them. And I think, maybe one of the problems within healthcare is that each person is so siloed. They're just like, well, come hell or come high water, I'm going to see you in March. It doesn't matter if someone just saw you in February and just did an exam, because this is when I'm seeing you. And I feel like that doesn't serve patients the best.
How does medicine define survivorship care?
This is a hot button issue. So the term survivorship actually just changed for cancer. So there was previously this demarcation of essentially someone on active treatment and someone who then transitioned into survivorship. But the new definition of survivorship, which I have kind of a love-hate relationship with, is that you are a survivor from the time you are diagnosed until the time you die, either of cancer or of other causes. And so that means everyone is a survivor, even if you're like my husband, who was never going to survive his cancer. It was not a, it was not a war of cancer. It was a massacre of cancer. There was no way of winning, Um, so I have a love-hate relationship with the term survivorship. I think ideally, when we think about survivorship, we're transitioning away from active treatment and we're starting to think about what are the things that help improve your life so that you can see cancer more as a dot in the distance that you see in your rearview mirror, but you're driving away from. And it's not to say that we never have to turn the car around, but that it's smaller and smaller in the distance. And it has less to do with kind of your day-to-day life. I think the reality is that for some people in some disease sites, cancer, either anxiety, fears, symptoms, long-term toxicities will be with them for the rest of their life, even if they're actual cancerisms.
Thank you for joining us today. I hope you found something in today's podcast that inspires you along your own life's path, because sometimes a bump in the road is actually a portal into a more conscious and meaningful life. You can subscribe to our free podcast at www.bumpintheroad.us or become a premium member to hear the full conversation. Just go to www.bumpintheroad.us for more information and to sign up.